Hey guys, tonight we trudge into medieval winters and the cold truth about homes with no fireplaces. Picture this: outside, the wind slices sideways like it's got a personal grudge against you, and inside, well, it's only marginally better. You're wrapped in your heaviest tunic, which smells faintly of sheep, and you're trying to convince yourself that seeing your breath indoors is just atmospheric. The stone floor is so cold it might as well be made of ice, and the walls? More holes than a moth-eaten blanket. The peasant's life wasn't romantic. It was teeth chattering, nose dripping, toes falling off cold. You probably won't survive this, unless you're ready to get very, very creative. And tonight, you'll find out exactly how peasants turned no fireplace from certain doom into mildly miserable survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and what time it is for you down in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself stepping into a world where houses are much more than stitched-up wounds in the fabric of the countryside. Forget brick walls and insulation. Most peasant homes are slumped together out of wattle and daub, a charming cocktail of sticks and mud plastered into rough panels. It's humble, it's earthy, and it's absolutely terrible at keeping out the cold. The walls practically sigh in the wind, and not in a comforting way. Small gaps where the daub has crumbled away let in drafts, turning every house into a glorified sieve. Historians still argue whether these gaps were intentional, maybe to let smoke from cooking fires drift out, or just signs of bad luck and worse construction. The floor is just packed earth, and let's not even talk about moisture. Every step squishes a little, a reminder that you're practically camping indoors for life. And the roof? A woven blanket of straw that's been battered by 100 storms. Rain leaks through the patches, and snow finds its way in when the winds get ambitious. You glance around for a fireplace, and surprise, there isn't one. Chimneys are an extravagance reserved for the rich. Instead, if there's any fire at all, it's just a pit dug into the middle of the floor, maybe circled by stones if someone's feeling fancy. The smoke has nowhere formal to go, except to seep into the rafters and hover just low enough to sting your eyes and nose. It's like living inside a poorly ventilated bonfire. Want to open a window? Too bad. Glass is a luxury reserved for cathedrals and castles. Peasants stick with wooden shutters, which stay tightly bolted for most of the winter unless someone's feeling brave or needs to chase out a rat. Either way, fresh air is a summer indulgence. And yet, despite the drafty walls, leaky roofs, and the ever-present smell of damp straw, this is home. Generations live and die under these sagging beams. Kids run barefoot across the frozen floors. Elders huddle near that smoky fire pit, noses red, fingers blue, trading gossip that's been repeated so often it practically creaks. Some peasants try stuffing moss or old cloth into the gaps between wall panels, a medieval take on weather stripping. Others hang rush mats or coarse woven fabrics along the inside walls to make a second, flimsy barrier against the chill. Still, for the most part, survival depends less on battling the cold, and more on outlasting it. Quirky fact for you, some villages actually leaned into the dampness, using the constant wet to cultivate edible mushrooms on their floors. That's right, you could literally harvest your side dish while shivering at the dinner table. As you settle in, you realize warmth wasn't really about comfort, it was about not dying. Peasants lived one icy breath away from frostbite, and no one was handing out fluffy blankets or puffy jackets. Instead, they learned that surviving winter was about layering up, huddling close, and learning to treat cold not as an enemy to defeat, but a roommate to tolerate. You shuffle deeper into the tiny house, still trying to warm your hands by friction alone, and you start to wonder, if the walls are hopeless, how did peasants really fight the cold? It wasn't fancy architecture or cutting-edge heating technology, that's for sure. It all started with what they wore. Picture this: you pull on a linen shift first, soft but thin, your basic underlayer. Over that, a coarse wool tunic or kirtle, depending on your status and gender. It's scratchy, smells faintly of the sheep it came from, and if you're lucky, it's only mildly damp. Wool wasn't just fashion, it was a medieval miracle fiber. It trapped heat even when wet, a literal lifesaver when the weather outside was doing its best to turn you into a peasant-shaped icicle. Most peasants didn't stop at one layer, though. They piled on as much as they could: double tunics, cloaks, shawls, and if things got truly desperate, they'd wrap themselves in old blankets or rags. Fashion was not the priority. Survival was. Historians still argue whether peasants had designated winter clothes or if they simply wore their best, red, least holy, outfits all year and prayed for the best. Either way, when winter came, layering was less about style and more about not freezing solid before breakfast. Shoes were another battlefield entirely. Leather boots existed, but unless you were unusually wealthy, you made do with wooden clogs, often stuffed with straw for extra insulation. Soggy, frozen straw, but hey, it was something. Some peasants even wrapped their feet in cloth or animal skins before cramming them into whatever footwear they had, a medieval version of layering socks. And gloves? If you could get them, yes, but many simply used the tried-and-true method of pulling sleeves down over their hands, sacrificing dexterity for a few extra degrees of warmth. Fine motor skills were optional in January. Quirky fact, in some regions, it wasn't unusual for peasants to smear their faces with animal fat, like beef tallow or even goose grease, to create a greasy barrier against the wind. Imagine going to bed with your cheeks shining like a polished boot. Even indoors, you'd stay wrapped up. There was no taking off your coat and getting comfy. You lived in your outdoor gear because inside and outside temperatures weren't that different. At best, the wind wasn't quite as personal indoors. Sleeping in clothes wasn't lazy, it was tactical. Peeling off your layers just meant losing precious body heat that you'd worked all day to trap. And honestly, laundering those clothes wasn't exactly a Saturday activity either. Washing one meant carefully soaking and drying it, an entire process that wasn't practical in sub-zero conditions, so most people just wore their clothes until they were basically an additional skin. Hygiene standards were flexible, frostbite was not. A fun little aside? Some sources suggest that certain peasants might have rubbed herbs like rosemary or thyme into their clothes, not for warmth, but to mask the increasingly robust smell. Because when you and everyone you know haven't washed their winter clothes since the last harvest, aromatherapy becomes less of a luxury and more of a public service. And yet, there was a weird kind of efficiency to it all. Wool tunics, linen underlayers, rough-spun cloaks, and greasy cheeks combined to create a human-shaped insulation system that could weather the worst winters. You weren't warm, exactly, but you also weren't dead. Close enough. You glance around this cramped, smoky house and realize something else. No one here is sleeping alone. Not because they're especially fond of each other, though sure, let's pretend it's about affection, but because body heat is the poor man's furnace. Families didn't just share beds, they packed them tight, every available body a portable radiator. Parents, kids, and sometimes even distant relatives crammed together under threadbare blankets. Sleeping solo was a luxury for kings and rich merchants, not for those trying to outlast a blizzard without a fireplace. Historians still argue whether this was purely practical or if there were layers of tradition and superstition woven in. Keeping the family physically close meant keeping them spiritually protected, too. Either way, the nightly cuddle puddle was real, and you weren't getting a lot of personal space. Beds weren't what you'd hoped for either. Forget about mattresses or even sturdy wooden frames. In many cases, you were lucky to have a simple wooden pallet elevated slightly off the damp ground. Most peasants made do with a sack stuffed with straw, maybe some dried leaves or moss if straw wasn't handy. Over time, that straw got compacted, dirty, and home to a few freeloaders, fleas, lice, the occasional confused beetle. Fun fact, in especially harsh winters, some families didn't even bother with formal sleeping arrangements. They'd all bundle up right in front of the smoldering central hearth, if there was one, or even burrow together into a straw pile on the floor. It wasn't luxurious, but the close quarters kept the cold at bay and turned each person into a tiny heat generator. You, squeezed between siblings, elbows digging into ribs, maybe a goat snuffling somewhere near your feet, would have found that comfort comes not from plush pillows but from the shared promise that you'd all wake up unfrozen the next morning. Mostly. The lack of privacy wasn't just accepted, it was essential. Even marriages sometimes didn't involve their own rooms. Just a slightly larger share of the family bed or a thin curtain hung up for the illusion of separation. And yes, the goats and chickens bunked in sometimes too, because animals put out a surprising amount of heat, and no medieval peasant was too proud to accept a little help from a bleating, farting neighbor. Peasants didn't snuggle just for the fun of it. They snuggled because that was the line between enduring the winter and becoming a cautionary tale for the spring thaw. If you were really lucky, your bedmates were heavy sleepers who didn't snore or kick. If not, well, You just added bruised ribs to your long list of winter grievances. Some clever families even created sleeping shifts. The older kids would share with each other first, and parents rotated through, spreading warmth and minimizing the chaos that comes with 8 people jostling on a sagging pile of straw. In a world without electric heaters, weighted blankets, or even reliable walls, warmth was a group project. Your breath fogged the air, your toes stayed tucked under someone else's knees, and if you were really blessed, the family dog claimed your feet like a fuzzy, living hot water bottle. Sure, he smelled like the barn, but so did you at this point. By the time the rooster crowed, you were stiff, sore, and still cold, but alive. And in the harsh reality of peasant life, that was a victory worth crabbing for. As you peel yourself away from the warmth of your makeshift sleeping pile, you realize another unspoken rule of survival: stay close to the ground. Not just for sleeping, but for existing, breathing, and sometimes even hiding from the worst of winter's cruelty. Why the floor? Simple physics. Warm air rises, even the scant scraps of it generated by body heat or a half-dead hearth fire. Down by the ground, temperatures were slightly more stable, not warm, mind you, just less vicious. You might be cold, but you weren't getting smacked in the face by the icy drafts swirling a few feet higher. Peasants figured this out early and, rather than fighting nature, they adapted. Beds sat low, if they existed at all. In some households, it wasn't uncommon to spread a thick layer of straw or rushes directly on the packed dirt floor. These weren't just for show, they acted as primitive insulation, keeping bare skin from touching the frozen ground and providing just enough cushioning to trick your body into thinking you weren't sleeping on permafrost. Historians still argue whether these floor coverings were changed regularly or if people just lived atop the same matted layer for entire seasons. Given the, let's say, relaxed hygiene standards of the time, the safe bet is somewhere between occasionally and only when absolutely necessary. The ground might also be shared with more than just your family. Small animals, hens, rabbits, the odd piglet, could snuggle into the rushes too, completely welcome as extra heat sources. Sure, you might wake up with a chicken roosting by your face, but in a cold snap, you're not getting picky. Fun fact, in some parts of medieval Europe, villagers would actually dig shallow pits in the floor to nestle into while they slept, effectively making a human burrow. It might sound absurd now, but it's the original sleeping bag idea, conserving your body heat in a pocket of earth. Sleeping close to the floor came with trade-offs, of course. You were also closer to the dampness, the scuttling insects, and the unfiltered aroma of livestock sharing your quarters. In short, cozy wasn't exactly the word you'd use. But against the brutal cold? Totally worth it. In better-off homes, and we're using better off very loosely here, there might be a raised wooden platform covered in straw, a slight elevation that helped avoid the worst chills while still reaping the benefits of the lower, warmer air. But for most peasants, a simple pile of rushes or old cloth was the best you could hope for. And forget about modern bed sheets or comforters. If you had an old woolen cloak, a fraying bit of blanket, or even a sheepskin, you clung to it with your life. It didn't matter if it was itchy or smelled faintly of mildew. You weren't winning beauty contests here, just the eternal fight against hypothermia. You'd hunker down, pulling every available layer tight around your shoulders, tucking your feet into whatever crevices you could find, and burrow like an oversized, very uncomfortable hedgehog. Dreams of roaring fires and soft pillows were luxuries for your next life. And yet, somehow, year after year, you survived. You woke to another day of frozen fields and brittle mornings, aching bones and stiff joints, but alive, and just a bit tougher than the cold that tried to claim you in the night. As dawn smears pale light across the thin cracks in your hovel's walls, you catch sight of movement at your feet. No, it's not a goblin, it's your most loyal winter companions, the animals. In a world without central heating, pets and livestock weren't just adorable, they were critical survival tools. See, peasants quickly learned that animals gave off heat, lots of it. A snoozing dog, a dozing piglet, even a cranky old cat became more valuable in winter than the fanciest embroidered tunic. You weren't sharing your living space with animals because you liked the company, though maybe you did. You did it because a warm goat butt against your leg could be the difference between frostbite and functional toes. Historians still argue whether animals inside homes were a widespread peasant tradition or more common in the grimmer, colder pockets of medieval Europe. But one thing's clear, when the nights hit bone-shattering lows, those beasts were coming inside whether you wanted them to or not. Dogs were obvious allies, loyal, furry, and often big enough to warm an entire foot. Cats weren't quite the snuggle pros, preferring to curl near the embers of a dying fire, but even their small bodies radiated heat. And while chickens don't sound particularly cuddly, a basket of hens tucked into a corner gave off a surprising amount of warmth. Even cows and goats were sometimes led into the one-room house and penned near the walls, creating a breathing, snorting, lulling barrier of heat. Quirky fact, in some places, pigs earned the nickname poor man's blanket. Fat, warm, and lazy by nature, they made excellent nighttime heat sources. Some peasants let their pigs sleep inside the house, right on the floor. Sure, it was loud, smelly, and probably a bit dangerous if you rolled over wrong, but it was warm. And it wasn't just about body heat. Animals brought a bit of psychological comfort too. The soft clucking of hens, the sleepy huff of a cow, the gentle snoring of a dog, these background noises filled the silence of long, cold nights, creating a kind of rustic lullaby. Of course, the downside was that medieval peasants lived in a swirling stew of smells, animal, human, and otherwise. You could try stuffing rushes or sweet-smelling herbs into the rush mats to mask the stench, but really, everyone just got used to it. And when you're busy shivering, you don't exactly have the luxury of being picky about air quality. Sharing your living quarters with animals was messy, noisy, and occasionally hazardous. Ever been kicked by a startled sheep in the middle of the night? Spoiler, it's not fun. But it worked. Every living creature in the house became a tiny, grumbling furnace. And so, you got comfortable with the idea that personal space was a modern fantasy. In the deep freeze of medieval winters, your best chance at survival was lying shoulder to shoulder with your family and, if you were lucky, a plump, snoring pig. Cozy, right? By now, you've accepted that warmth in this drafty little box of a house comes from anything but the walls. But take a good look at the floor, specifically, what's piled and scattered all over it. Straw. Hay. Rushes. Layers of it. Turns out, medieval peasants were the original masters of DIY insulation. When you can't build thicker walls or seal every draft, you get creative. Straw was cheap, abundant after the harvest, and surprisingly effective at trapping heat. You'd spread it thick over the packed dirt floor, basically making yourself a giant, crunchy, homespun carpet. Each stalk of straw trapped little pockets of air, creating a barrier between your freezing feet and the permafrost earth below. Historians still argue whether these straw floors were regularly maintained or if people just added more layers as they decayed into mulch. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Rush mats, which are woven layers of reeds or grasses, were sometimes used instead of loose straw, giving a slightly more stable, and slightly less vermin-infested, surface to walk and sleep on. Fun fact, peasants didn't just use straw on the floors. In a pinch, they stacked it against walls to help block the wind. Old clothes and rags might be tucked into the gaps in walls, but straw was abundant and easy to replenish. Some even stuffed it inside their sleeping clothes for extra insulation. Yes, inside. Imagine waking up with bits of straw poking you in places you didn't even know could itch. And when it came to sleeping arrangements, straw and hay stuffed into rough canvas sacks created the earliest forms of mattresses. Sure, they flattened out and grew musty within weeks, but compared to sleeping directly on the frozen floor, it was sheer luxury. A quirky little aside, if you were really creative or desperate, you could even build a straw bed canopy. Piling bundles of straw over a simple wooden frame gave you a mini roof over your bed that trapped rising body heat and kept it from escaping straight up into the rafters. It was like building a fort that doubled as survival gear. Of course, with warmth came other things. Straw made a perfect home for fleas, lice, and the occasional enterprising rat. The floor wasn't just your sleeping surface, it was a living, wriggling ecosystem. But hey, at least the rats were warm too. Despite all the drawbacks, layering straw and hay wasn't optional, it was as vital as wearing a cloak or huddling together at night. It transformed a bleak, barren room into something marginally more livable. And when the snow piled high and the wind howled like an angry ghost outside, a thick floor of straw meant you could dig in, tuck deep under your itchy woolen blanket, and dream, briefly and poorly, of summer days to come. You shuffle across the straw-strewn floor, brushing dust off your tunic, and your eye falls on another crucial weapon in the peasant anti-winter arsenal, the bed itself. Or rather, the chaotic heap of fabrics pretending to be one. Blankets back then weren't the fluffy, cloud-like affairs we think of today. They were heavy, coarse, and often patched to within an inch of their lives. Wool was the material of choice, not because it was comfortable, but because it did its job even when soaked through. You'd layer up whatever you had, old cloaks, worn-out tunics, bits of hide if you were lucky. The more mismatched and scratchy, the better. And it wasn't just one layer. Oh no! Smart peasants layered their beds like onions. A linen sheet might go down first if you were really fancy, mostly to keep the coarsest fabrics off your skin. Then came one or two thick woolen covers, each heavier than the last. You'd top that off with anything else handy, old cloaks, even grain sacks if they weren't needed elsewhere. Historians still argue whether peasants had access to real bedding or if they simply repurposed whatever wasn't already worn on their backs. Evidence leans toward the latter. If it was fabric and vaguely rectangular, onto the bed it went. Quirky fact, in some places, old cloaks were stitched together to form enormous communal covers, giant patchwork quilts made from every scrap of discarded clothing a household could muster. Imagine a blanket that told the story of your family's last decade of bad tailoring decisions. A special trick was to use the family cloaks, large, thick garments meant for travel, as the topmost layer. A good cloak wasn't just for blustery days, it doubled as a sleeping bag in the cold months. Some folks even slept with their cloaks still on, bundled tightly around them, with the blanket just serving as an extra shield against the night air. You'd tuck in tight, layering yourself like a sandwich. Person, cloak, blanket, another cloak if you were rich in fabric fortune. And if your toes still turned blue? Well, that's what hot bricks were for, but we're getting to that. Beds themselves were a loose concept. Maybe a rough wooden frame if you had a few spare coins. Maybe just a pallet raised on stones. Anything to get a few inches higher and a little less damp. Some families had actual feather mattresses, but for most peasants, stuffing the mattress with straw or rushes was standard. Over time, that straw flattened, decomposed, and basically turned into a new layer of the earth, but you were still grateful for the slight lift off the icy ground. Fun little detail, the phrase sleep tight comes from this period. Beds with ropes strung across wooden frames needed tightening regularly, or you'd end up sagging in the middle like a wool-wrapped hammock. Tight ropes meant better support, and fewer rude awakenings when you rolled into a sibling's elbow. Still, no amount of blankets or clever tucking could erase the fact that medieval nights were long, cold, and brutal. But with enough layers, enough bodies, and enough stubbornness, you could slip into a rough, scratchy sleep and dream, if only for a few moments, of a world where fires roared and stone hearths and feather beds didn't crawl with fleas. But sometimes even the heaviest blanket stack wasn't enough. When the wind slipped through the walls like a ghost with a grudge, peasants had to get a little more creative. Enter one of the simplest, cleverest tricks of medieval winter survival, the humble hot stone. No fireplace? No problem. You'd take a stone, preferably one that wasn't already cracked or crumbly, and nestle it deep into whatever meager fire you could muster, or even the coals left smoldering from a cooking pit. After an hour or so, the stone would be piping hot, radiating a heat that felt downright luxurious against frozen fingers. You'd wrap the stone in a bit of cloth, maybe a scrap of worn linen or wool, and tuck it down at the foot of your bed. There, it would spend the night slowly releasing its borrowed warmth, keeping your toes from turning into medieval popsicles. If you were really clever and willing to risk mild burns, you could even have two stones, one for the feet, one for hugging clothes under the covers. Historians still argue whether this trick was common knowledge across peasant villages or if it was a luxury reserved for slightly better-off households. After all, stones aren't exactly rare, but having a reliable fire to heat them? That was another story entirely. Quirky fact, in some areas, peasants used bricks instead of stones. Bricks were better at holding heat longer, and they were flatter, meaning less risk of awkwardly bruising yourself when you kicked them in your sleep. There's even some evidence that heated metal plates, an early, much more dangerous version of the hot water bottle, were used when bricks weren't available. Nothing says goodnight like the possibility of searing your bedsheets. Of course, there was a fine line between warm toes and accidental house fire. You had to be careful to wrap the stone well and place it so it didn't smolder the straw mattress or catch a threadbare blanket on fire. Medieval houses were, after all, famously flammable. Portable heat didn't stop at bedtime. Some peasants carried small heated stones tucked into pockets or inside wraps of cloth, holding them under cloaks during the day as a kind of primitive hand warmer. It was a delicate balancing act, warm enough to stave off frostbite, not so hot that you singed a hole through your only tunic. Fun aside, a few extra resourceful peasants used their pots and pans for dual purposes, heating water during the day, then pouring the hot water into a sturdy, corked bottle at night to create a medieval hot water bottle. Practical, if a bit splashy. It wasn't perfect. The heat faded fast, especially in the brutal dead of winter. And the stones were heavy, awkward, and didn't exactly scream luxury. But when the frost crept up the walls and your breath hung in the air like mist, clutching a lump of warmed rock could feel like the height of comfort. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to buy you a few hours of real sleep before the cold came creeping back in. You might think that after a day of freezing in the fields and a night of shivering under scratchy blankets, peasants would just give up and accept being permanently half-frozen. But no, there was one more trick up their tattered sleeves: each other. And not just the family dog and kids packed into a single bed, everyone. Communal warmth was the secret weapon of peasant villages. When the cold really bit down, people did the most logical thing: they gathered together. Crowded rooms weren't just cozy, they were tactical. More bodies meant more heat, and peasants weren't above throwing a winter feast or two just for the excuse of packing as many humans as possible into one smoky hut. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were more about social survival or literal temperature control. Probably both. After all, it's easier to forget you're freezing when you're packed in so tightly that you can barely move your elbows. The alehouse became a winter survival hub, especially after a good brewing. Alehouses weren't just for getting tipsy, they were unofficial gathering spots, where bodies could huddle together, mugs could warm hands, and the combined heat of bad breath and worse jokes made the air marginally more bearable. Fun fact, in some regions, public feasts were deliberately scheduled for the coldest months, not just to lighten the mood but because gathering 30 sweaty peasants into a small hall generated enough body heat to make a real difference. Sure, it smelled like a damp laundry basket mixed with cabbage stew, but hey, you were warm enough to unfreeze your toes. Even beyond alehouses, families would swap homes for overnight stays, packing 3 or 4 extended families into one larger building. Floor space became premium real estate. If you could find even a scrap of straw to curl up on between Auntie Agnes and Cousin Walter, you were winning at winter. And you didn't just sit around telling ghost stories. Communal gatherings usually meant shared chores, mending clothes, shelling beans, fixing tools, all activities that kept fingers busy and blood moving. Every chore was a chance to stay active, huddle close, and trick your body into thinking the season wasn't slowly trying to murder you. Quirky little aside, sometimes, animals were included in these communal setups, too. Bring your goat to dinner day? Totally normal if it meant a few extra degrees of warmth from Fluffy standing by the door. It wasn't glamorous. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and wet wool. Lice probably threw their own little feasts in the crowd. But when it's you versus winter, dignity takes a back seat to survival. Communal living, loud, crowded, messy, was medieval central heating, powered by neighborly tolerance and sheer stubbornness. And when you finally staggered home afterward, your tunic reeking of ale and damp sheep, at least you carried a bit of that communal warmth with you, enough to survive one more night under your sagging, flea-ridden blanket. By now, you're probably realizing that the medieval peasant winter survival plan was 80% cuddle up and 20% hope for the best, and when it came to cramming bodies into small spaces, the math was surprisingly effective. See, there's a little trick of physics that peasants understood instinctively long before anyone could explain it with fancy science words. More people equals more heat. Each human body, even in a half-frozen, underfed state, gives off about as much warmth as a small space heater, roughly 100 watts. Pack a few people together, and suddenly you're operating at medieval Michelin star heating levels. Historians still argue whether peasants deliberately engineered their living spaces for this effect or if it was just a lucky byproduct of poverty and overcrowding. Either way, the result was the same: a full house was a warm house, or at least, a less cold house. Peasant homes weren't the sprawling manors you see in period dramas. They were small, single-room structures, and that was actually part of the strategy. Lower ceilings, cramped walls, and tiny doors weren't architectural flaws. They were survival features. Smaller spaces trapped what little heat there was, whether it came from the smoky fire pit, the damp breath of livestock, or the collective output of half a dozen snoring relatives. Quirky fact, some peasant families even rigged up simple partition walls made of cloth or rush mats to create mini-rooms within the house. Smaller spaces meant less area for heat to escape and gave the illusion of privacy, Because nothing says private bedroom like a thin, flammable curtain between you and your snoring uncle. And don't forget the livestock. A cow, for example, puts out as much heat as a dozen people. That's right, one placid, cut-chewing cow in the corner of your hut could outpace the entire family when it came to heating power. Sheep and goats weren't quite as impressive, but still significant. If you could coax a few into the house, you'd not only survive the night, you might even feel your toes in the morning. Of course, cramming that many bodies into a tight space came with its own set of problems: smells, noise, and a distinct lack of personal hygiene. Bathing wasn't a winter priority, mostly because breaking ice for water was hard work and standing around wet in freezing air was a shortcut to pneumonia. So, everybody smelled, like everybody else. Comfort in numbers, discomfort in scents. Yet somehow, it worked. Huddled together, wrapped in every rag and cloak they could find, peasants turned their squalid huts into human ovens. Not warm, exactly. Not cozy. But livable. And that was enough. One fun aside, when peasants did get the chance to visit bigger buildings, like a church or a lord's manor, they'd often marvel not at the wealth or grandeur but at how hard it was to stay warm in such cavernous, high-ceilinged spaces. Bigger wasn't better, bigger was colder. So, you learned to love the closeness, the shared warmth, and the low ceilings pressing down like an itchy woolen cap. In the fight against winter, a cramped, smelly room full of unwashed relatives was less a hardship and more a kind of ragtag armor. Cozy? Not really. Effective? Absolutely. You blink up at the low, soot-darkened beams of the ceiling and realize, this house isn't just small, it's designed to keep every scrap of warmth from slipping away. No grand vaulted ceilings here. No open floor plans. Just snug, claustrophobic practicality. Peasant homes were intentionally built with low ceilings and thatched roofs, not because they were short on materials, though they often were, but because these features were survival strategies. Low ceilings meant the little warmth generated by bodies, fires, and the occasional snoring pig didn't have as far to rise before being trapped. Historians still argue whether this was an accident of peasant poverty or a clever adaptation born out of sheer desperation. Either way, the result was the same, a house where, if you stood up too fast, you'd knock your forehead against a beam, but at least your breath didn't freeze midair. The thatched roofs, layered thick with straw, were not only cheap and accessible but also excellent insulators. The air pockets within the thatch worked like nature's version of fiberglass insulation. Snow piling on top during winter only improved things, a natural layer of frozen reinforcement, helping trap what little warmth the home could gather. Quirky fact, some peasants would intentionally let the outer layers of thatch rot a little because the matted, decomposing straw was even better at holding in heat than fresh-cut bundles. Yes, your roof might leak a little more in spring, but that was a problem for future you. Windows were small, often just slits or holes, with wooden shutters or oiled cloth coverings, because glass was wildly expensive. Large, grand windows might let in more light, but they also leaked warmth faster than a sieve leaks water. Better to have a small, shuttered opening you could cover up tight when the wind howled. The door? Heavy, solid, and low, forcing you to duck in and out. Not just for the comedic value, though watching your neighbor whack his head every day was a bonus, but because small doorways meant less heat loss and less chance for winter's icy claws to grab you as you stumbled inside. Fun aside, some houses even had deliberately uneven floors, slightly sunken in the middle, to trap warmer air near the center where the family slept. It wasn't much, but even a degree or two could make a difference when the alternative was frostbite. Even the layout of the room mattered. Peasants clustered their sleeping areas toward the center or leeward side of the house, away from the worst drafts. Cooking areas were set near the door where smoke could drift out more easily, and livestock pens were close to human sleeping spots for maximum shared warmth. Everything, from the drooping thatch above to the dirt floor below, worked toward one goal: contain the heat. In a way, the entire house was like a medieval thermos, crude, scratchy, and riddled with fleas, but astonishingly effective. And when the blizzards rolled in and the world turned white and howling outside, you'd be huddled under your pile of cloaks, shoulder to shoulder with your kin and critters, listening to the wind batter the walls, and feeling, maybe, just maybe, a little smug that you were still standing. You shuffle across the room, nose wrinkling as you pass the goat's chosen sleeping spot, and glance at the outside wall. It's thick, but not thick enough, and patched with mud so sloppily that you swear you can see the winter moon peeking through. Medieval peasants knew they couldn't rebuild their entire homes each winter, so they developed a few clever tricks to fight the wind without needing a carpenter's skills. Welcome to the world of medieval windbreaks, the art of keeping winter out using whatever was lying around. First up, bushes. That's right, shrubs weren't just decoration, they were medieval winter armor. Peasants planted thick, scruffy hedges around their homes to blunt the force of the wind. Willow, hawthorn, and even tightly packed gorse formed living barriers, catching the worst of the gales before they could slam straight into those flimsy wattle and daub walls. Historians still argue whether these hedgerows were primarily for wind protection or for marking property lines. Probably both. But ask anyone stuck behind a hedge in a January storm, it makes a difference. When bushes weren't enough, or when they were buried under snow, peasants got hands-on. They'd build low mud walls or stack sod along the most wind-blasted side of the house. These barriers absorbed the worst of the gusts and kept the lower walls from freezing solid. Quirky fact, in especially brutal winters, some villagers went full hermit crab mode and banked up piles of manure along the walls. Fresh dung releases heat as it decomposes, and while it's not going to replace your fireplace anytime soon, it offered just enough extra warmth to matter. Yes, your house smelled amazing. But frozen noses are less picky than you'd think. Inside the house, peasants deployed a second line of defense. They hung up whatever they could, woolen rags, old cloaks, even animal skins, over the walls and doors. These makeshift tapestries acted like primitive insulation, catching drafts and slowing down the endless, icy creep of winter air. You might laugh at the idea of a door made from a reused grain sack nailed to a post, but when the wind was howling like a banshee outside, you'd clutch that sack like it was spun from gold. Fun aside, some peasants even stuffed straw into cracks and crevices around windows and doors. Straw was the medieval equivalent of foam sealant, cheap, available, and good enough to keep out the worst of the drafts. When it decayed, you just stuffed in some more. Eco-friendly before eco-friendly was even a concept. The goal wasn't comfort. It was survival. Every barrier, every stuff gap, every sagging hedge was another shield between the fragile human bodies inside and the brutal, unrelenting winter outside. And when the snow fell sideways and the wind screeched over the hills, you'd burrow a little deeper into your cloak, grateful for every muddy, smelly, patchwork windbreak standing between you and the cold. You tighten your cloak around your shoulders and tug your hood lower as a cold draft snakes its way along the floor. Hoods, let's talk about those. You might think of them as a fashion accessory or something worn for mysterious effect in moody historical dramas, but in the medieval peasant world, hoods were survival gear. That it wasn't just there to keep rain off your face. It was your best defense against losing the precious heat your body fought so hard to keep. Modern science tells us you lose a significant amount of body heat through your head. Peasants didn't need thermodynamics to figure that out. They just knew that if you didn't cover your noggin, you froze faster. Enter the medieval hood, long, heavy, and designed to drape not just over your head but your shoulders too. It was a bit like wearing a small, woolen tent. Some hoods even extended down to mid-chest, layering over your tunic or cloak to trap more warmth close to the skin. Historians still argue whether the hood was purely a cold-weather garment or just everyday wear year-round. Realistically, for peasants, it was both. Fabric was expensive, and no one had the luxury of a seasonal wardrobe. That had protected you from rain, sun, and, most crucially, the soul-crushing damp cold of winter. Quirky fact, some hoods were made detachable, fastening to a cloak with simple toggles or ties. This meant you could unbutton it and drape it over your face or shoulders as needed, a medieval multifunctional hoodie. And yes, in case you're wondering, some hoods had a tiny built-in scarf that wrapped around the neck for extra insulation. Fashion-forward and functional. The key was layering smartly. You wore a linen shirt under your woolen tunic, maybe a second tunic if you own one, and always a cloak, thick, heavy, and preferably lined with something even remotely warm, like fur scraps if you were lucky. Over that, your hood, pulled tight and snug against the wind's howling advances. Peasants mastered the art of tucking. Cloaks were fastened with brooches or simple ties at the chest and then wrapped tight around the body, overlapping at the front and tucking in at the waist if you had a belt or rope. Hoods were pulled down low, and in the worst weather, cloaks were pinned so close they'd barely let a wisp of cold air through. Fun aside, some peasants also wore hand-me-down hose, basically medieval leggings, tied at the waist and worn under tunics for extra leg warmth. Tuck everything into everything else, and you had a personal cocoon of dubious comfort and questionable hygiene. Sure, you probably looked like a lumpy, bedraggled turnip. But looks weren't the goal. You could shuffle out into the biting cold, your hood shadowing your eyes, your cloak wrapped tight, and feel smugly superior to the icy wind. And inside, at night, you didn't shed these layers. You burrowed deeper into them, turned the hood sideways to cover more of your face, and used the cloak as an extra blanket. Your medieval wardrobe didn't hang in a closet, it came to bed with you. All in all, the cloak and hood combo was the medieval version of a heated jacket and scarf in one, a personal fortress against the cold. Not perfect, but then again, perfection was never the point. Survival was. And in that game, a well-tied cloak and a snug hood could mean the difference between another miserable morning and not waking up at all. You stir under your bundle of blankets and straw and realize, while the hood kept your head snug and your cloak protected your core, what about the parts most likely to freeze first? Enter the unsung heroes of medieval winterwear, the nightcap and foot wraps. You wouldn't dream of going to bed without covering your head, even indoors. Cold air swirling around your ears all night could undo all the hard work of your layers. So, before settling in, you'd tug on a nightcap, nothing fancy, just a simple wool or linen cap that hugged your head close and maybe tied under your chin for good measure. Historians still argue whether the average peasant nightcap was a standard item or more a hand-me-down luxury. But let's be real, if you had even a scrap of cloth, you'd find a way to fashion it into a makeshift cap. Sleep without one? Only if you fancied waking up with icicles for sideburns. Quirky fact, some medieval nightcaps came with extra long tails you could wrap around your neck like a scarf. Multifunctional and stylish, if your definition of stylish is looking like a very grumpy elf. And then, there were your feet. If you've ever experienced the agony of frozen toes, you know they're traitors, cold faster than the rest of you and stubborn about warming back up. Enter foot wraps, strips of cloth, old rags, or even worn-out bits of leather, wound around your feet before slipping into your boots, or, more often, before shoving them under layers of straw and blanket. No socks? No problem. Medieval peasants invented their own DIY version. The cloth acted as insulation, trapping air and creating a vital barrier against the chill. Thick foot wraps even helped cushion the feet against the rough wooden floors and the straw bedding. Sure, it wasn't exactly like slipping into fleece slippers, but it was better than losing a toe. Fun aside, some particularly clever peasants would heat their foot wraps by the fire, or even the hot stone, before bundling up for bed. Toasty toes for at least a few precious minutes, until the cold inevitably slithered back in. And no, the layering didn't stop there. Hands got wrapped too. If you had an extra strip of cloth, you'd wind it around your fingers, leaving you looking like you were preparing for a medieval boxing match rather than bedtime. Layers upon layers, fabric against skin, skin against fabric, all trying to fight off the creeping cold. Of course, all this wrapping came with its challenges. Move too much at night and you'd wake up with your nightcap askew, your foot wraps unraveled, and your cloak strangling your knees. Sleeping became a delicate balancing act of staying bundled while not suffocating yourself under 30 pounds of wool and straw. But when the fire pit was little more than glowing embers and the wind rattled the shutters like a banshee trying to get in, your nightcap, your foot wraps, and your awkward, too-tight cloak cocoon were the difference between misery and mild discomfort. You couldn't beat winter, but you could outstubborn it, one wrapped toe and one tied under the chin nightcap at a time. Morning creeps over the horizon, dull and gray, and you rise from your cocoon of rags and straw, still half frozen but alive. There's one more secret to surviving a day in a medieval winter: you fuel the furnace from the inside out. In other words, you eat. No, not dainty meals served on silver platters. You're shoveling in heavy, dense, belly-filling food, the kind that sticks to your ribs and reminds your body it's supposed to be warm. Peasants knew that what you ate mattered almost as much as what you wore. Start your day with pottage, a thick stew made from whatever was lying around: barley, beans, root vegetables, maybe a scrap of salted pork if the gods were kind. It simmered low and slow, and by low and slow we mean sometimes for days. Each day, more ingredients were tossed in as needed, basically a medieval slow cooker meal, just with a slightly more suspicious smell. Historians still argue whether pottage was nutritious or just barely edible. Probably a bit of both. It was thick, hot, and filling, the three pillars of peasant winter cuisine. Quirky fact, some villagers had a communal stew pot kept simmering in a central hearth for weeks at a time. Families would contribute what they could, and in return, everyone got a ladleful of warmth in their bowl. Think of it as the original, slightly unhygienic soup kitchen. For the real workhorse meal, you turned to porridge. Oats or barley boiled until they turned into something that resembled glue, but hot glue. Throw a bit of milk in if you had a goat feeling generous. Maybe some honey if last summer's beehive raid had gone well. Mostly, though, it was just hot grain sludge, and it was exactly what you needed to trick your body into believing it wasn't freezing to death. Fatty meats were prized in winter because fat meant fuel. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of lard or butter, you used it liberally. Spread it on bread, toss it in the pottage, or just eat it straight, no judgments here. Fat burns slowly, keeps you feeling full, and gives your body a fighting chance against the cold. No medieval peasant ever turned the nose up at a greasy bit of bacon when the snow was knee-deep outside. Fun aside, peasants believed that onions and garlic helped keep the body warm. So, lots of meals involved root vegetables that doubled as heating agents and, as a bonus, kept everyone's personal scent profile memorable. Meals weren't fancy, but they were strategic. A hot bowl of porridge in the morning, a steaming ladle of pottage in the evening, maybe a hunk of dark bread, hard enough to chip a tooth, but hearty enough to give you something to chew on between chores. And let's not forget the humble ale. Low in alcohol, high in calories, and safer than questionable well water, it was the medieval energy drink of choice. You needed those carbs, and ale delivered, with a side of buzz to make the cold feel just a little less personal. You didn't just eat to survive, you ate to stay warm. Every spoonful was a reminder to your body, keep going, keep burning, keep living. In a world where frostbite lurked at every corner, the kitchen fire and the humble stew pot were just as important as your scratchy cloak and your flea-ridden straw mattress. Eat well, layer up, huddle close, and maybe, just maybe, you'd see spring. As the day plods on and the thin sun makes its brief, half-hearted appearance, you notice another small mercy, the flickering light of tallow candles and rushlights. In a world where the dark hours outnumbered the daylight, and warmth was as scarce as luxury, even the smallest flame was a blessing, and, as it turned out, a bit of heat. Candles weren't just for light. They were tiny, stubborn beacons of warmth. One tallow candle, made by laboriously rendering down animal fat, might not heat a room, but gather a few together and you'd feel the difference. Tallow burned dirty and smoky, smelling like a cross between overcooked bacon and regret, but it was cheap and available to anyone who had access to livestock or a slaughterhouse. Historians still argue whether rushlights, thin reeds soaked in animal fat, were more popular than candles among peasants. Rushlights burned faster and had to be replaced more often, but they were much cheaper. Gather reeds from the marsh, soak them in grease, and voila, medieval mood lighting on budget. Quirky fact, some particularly thrifty peasants would save kitchen drippings and pour them over old rushes for a DIY rushlight. Waste not, want not, even if it meant your candles smelled suspiciously like last week's stew. Sure, one candle didn't throw much heat, but the collective effect was real. Clustered together on a central table or hung carefully around the room, they warmed the immediate air and gave off enough light to make the shadows a little less ominous. More importantly, they tricked your brain into feeling warmer. There's something about seeing fire, even small flickering flames, that reassures the body that everything isn't entirely falling apart. Of course, there were risks. Open flames in a house made of sticks, mud, straw, and hope were not exactly safe. Fires were common, devastating, and always just a toppled candle away. Which is why the most responsible peasants kept their candles in iron or clay holders, basic, heavy, hard to tip over unless a particularly stubborn goat got curious. Fun aside, some rushlights were mounted on stands with adjustable heights so you could move the flame closer to your work or your frozen fingers. Medieval luxury, right there. The downside? Tallow candles stank. They smoked. They sputtered. In a closed room packed with humans, livestock, and layers of damp wool, the smell could get so overpowering that opening the door to a howling snowstorm started to seem appealing. But nobody complained, not seriously, because that little flicker of greasy flame meant you could eat, mend clothes, or tell a story without freezing in the pitch dark. And when the sun finally sank beyond the hills at 3 in the afternoon and the long, endless winter night closed in again, you'd gather close to that dim, flickering light. You'd pull your cloak tighter, adjust your nightcap, and pretend that the small bubble of light and marginal warmth was enough to hold back the cold in the dark. It wasn't a fireplace. It wasn't even close. But it was something. And in the world of the medieval peasant, something was often the difference between surviving and becoming a sad little footnote in the village records come spring. You blow gently on your stiff fingers, watching the rushlight flicker, and glance outside, just for a second. The wind howls like it's trying to peel the thatch right off your roof, and the snow drifts lean heavy against the door. It's clear, you're not going anywhere. And frankly, that's the plan. Peasants didn't scatter their homes across the countryside by accident. They huddled together, house beside house, clustered around a well, a church, a central green, not because they liked the gossip, though, honestly, who didn't, but because close quarters meant survival. Villages were designed to be tight, cramped, and yes, a little smelly, because in the depths of winter, density was defense. Historians still argue whether village clustering was more about communal labor or mutual warmth. Spoiler, it was both. Sharing resources, borrowing livestock, patching each other's roofs, these were winter lifelines. But just as important was the simple, brilliant advantage of blocking the wind. The village wasn't just a social structure, it was a human windbreak. A tangle of huts, cottages, and outbuildings that, together, created calmer patches of air. Homes that stood shoulder to shoulder offered shelter not only from the elements but from the bitter loneliness of the long, dark months. Quirky fact, some medieval maps show villages designed in rings or tight, spiral patterns, maximizing the number of homes protected from the worst winter gales. Early medieval city planners, accidental geniuses of wind resistance. Beyond physical protection, there was the warmth of community itself. Communal bonfires, group feasts, and the endless cycle of shared labor meant you were rarely alone for long. Isolation was dangerous, not just for your body, but for your mind. A lonely peasant was a peasant who might give up when the firewood ran out or the stew pot emptied. And so, you lived elbow to elbow with your neighbors. You heard their arguments through the thin wattle walls. You smelled their cooking, or burning, depending on the cook's skills. You swapped stories over shared work and bartered turnips for rushlights. You helped patch roofs, mended torn cloaks, and huddled together on the longest nights when the cold threatened to squeeze the breath right out of the village. Fun aside, some villages had winter traditions of shared storytelling marathons. Families would gather by the dim, sputtering light and take turns spinning tales, some terrifying, some hilarious, all designed to pass the endless dark hours until the faintest hint of morning arrived. When you lived in a clustered village, the entire community was your survival strategy. It was messy, loud, and guaranteed that everyone knew way too much about everyone else's business, but it kept you alive. And in the dead of winter, when the world seemed frozen in place and even the sun seemed reluctant to show up for work, that human closeness was its own kind of fire. You tuck your knees tighter to your chest, the thin blanket barely trapping your body heat, and consider one last desperate measure against the cold. Magic? Or at least, what passed for it in the minds of medieval peasants. See, when you patched every wall, layered every tunic, and still shivered so hard your teeth rattled, there was one more thing left to try: superstition. After all, if physical defenses weren't enough, why not turn to the unseen forces? The idea that cold wasn't just weather but a malevolent spirit was surprisingly common. Historians still argue whether these winter superstitions were widespread or just pockets of old traditions lingering on the edges of Christian Europe. But everywhere you looked, people carried little charms against the cold, muttered prayers, and engaged in tiny rituals meant to keep death by frost at bay. One popular talisman? Garlic. Hung in doorways, tucked into rafters, or even worn on strings around the neck, garlic wasn't just for warding off illness or vampires. Peasants believed its strong smell and fiery nature could help repel the wickedness of winter. Did it work? Debatable. But at least it masked the scent of unwashed wool a little. Quirky fact, in some regions, peasants would whisper charms into the wind, short little rhymes pleading for gentler weather, spoken quickly and quietly, like a bribe slip to nature itself. Some folks even sang to their livestock, believing that a happy cow or a soothed pig would sleep more soundly and share more of its valuable body heat. Then there were more creative solutions. Some villagers painted protective symbols on their doors using soot and animal fat. Others placed iron tools, hammers, scythes, near entrances to ward off evil spirits believed to ride on the howling wind. These weren't decorations, they were battle lines drawn against the invisible forces believed to bring death and suffering. Fun aside, in particularly desperate times, some communities staged mock trials where the winter was personified as a wicked old crone or a malevolent spirit, and symbolically chased out of the village by shouting, singing, and banging on pots and pans. Early medieval noise cancelling, if you will. And of course, prayers, lots of them. Special saints were invoked for protection against frostbite and starvation. Saint Blaise, Saint Sebastian, even Saint Nicholas before he became the jolly fellow we know today. Some peasants would scratch crude crosses into door frames or fence posts, a quiet appeal for divine insulation. These acts weren't just desperate superstition. They were tiny, stubborn declarations that even when facing down the cruelest of seasons, the peasants weren't powerless. Every chant, every garlic braid, every soot-smudged charm was a way of saying, "You haven't beaten us yet." And maybe, just maybe, wrapped in their scratchy cloaks, clutching garlic strings and whispering to the dark, they found a sliver of hope to keep them going until the ice began to thaw and life returned. You roll over on the prickly straw, your breath rising in misty tendrils, and realize something. Survival wasn't just about making it through each day, it was about waiting, enduring, outlasting. And peasants knew that no matter how brutal the winter, eventually, spring would come. Spring wasn't just another season for medieval peasants, it was a full-on rebirth. Winter was a slow, grinding death. Spring was salvation. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants celebrated spring as formally as we romanticize it today. Sure, May Day festivities and spring fairs became common later, but even before then, there was a gut-deep awareness that this was the true new year, not some distant January date most peasants couldn't even point to on a calendar. The moment the ground thawed and the first green shoots poked their heads through the mud, you could feel the shift in the village. Spirits lifted. Shoulders straightened. People laughed more freely, even if their ribs still showed under their tunics. Quirky fact, some medieval communities held tiny spring festivals with what little food and ale they hadn't consumed just to mark the fact that they were still alive. Imagine a feast of moldy cheese, hard bread, and last fall's cider, and yet it probably tasted better than anything all winter long. Spring wasn't just about warmth. It meant the return of work, yes, but work meant purpose. Plowing, sowing, repairing the damage winter had done to huts and hedgerows. It meant moving out of the cramped, smoky hovels and into the fresh, if still chilly, air. It meant shedding a few of the heavy layers you'd been swaddled in for months and remembering what it felt like to stretch without groaning. There's an old saying that spring comes in on cat's feet, quiet, sneaky. The first signs were small. Ice melting into rivulets along the paths. Birds that hadn't sung since November daring a few cautious notes. The earth softening just enough that your boot left a proper footprint, instead of skidding across frozen ruts. Fun aside, in some villages, children would run around barefoot the very first day the snow melted, no matter how cold it still was, just to prove that the worst was over. Did they immediately catch colds? Probably. Did they care? Not at all. Peasants didn't have calendars pinned to rough-hewn walls. They read the seasons in the air, the soil, the tilt of the sun. And after a winter spent huddling against the cold, eating thin gruel, and whispering charms into the wind, spring felt like a second chance. No fanfare. No fireworks. Just the quiet, stubborn unfolding of life. Buds on trees. Lambs bleating in the meadows. A new coat of mud on the village paths. Messy, wet, glorious mud. You'd still be poor. You'd still be tired. But you wouldn't be frozen anymore. You'd made it through the long dark, wrapped in scratchy wool, clutching greasy rushlights, sleeping nose-to-goat nose with the family pig. And that was worth celebrating. You sit back, gazing at the slushy, thawing world beyond the door, and realize what a triumph it is just to have endured. Winter didn't break you. It tried, oh, it tried, but here you were, thin, exhausted, probably flea-bitten, but breathing. In the end, peasants stayed warm without fireplaces not because they had secret tricks or magic technology. They survived because they adapted. Because they accepted discomfort as a fact of life and treated survival as a community sport. Because they layered wool over linen, slept nose-to-nose with the dog, and buried themselves under straw, cloaks, and sheer stubbornness. Their homes were crooked and drafty, their fires smoky and weak, their meals grimy and sparse, but they kept moving. They packed into low, soot-stained rooms. They sealed their walls with mud and their bodies with lard. They sang to their cows and muttered charms against the wind. And somehow, against every cold, miserable odd, they made it through. Historians still argue whether life back then was pure misery or whether peasants found moments of contentment even in hardship. It's hard to say. Maybe it's both. Maybe you'd be shivering under your rushlight, draped in every cloak and rag you owned, and still find a way to laugh at your neighbor's story about the pig who wouldn't share a blanket. Quirky fact to end on, even into the 19th century, rural families in parts of Europe kept to some of these old methods: bed sharing, hay insulation, even smearing themselves with goose grease for warmth. It wasn't just medieval eccentricity, it was survival wisdom passed down through generations. And now, as the first flowers push stubbornly through the thawing ground and the days stretch a little longer, you sit there, blinking in the strange, unfamiliar sunlight. It's not warm yet, not really. But the worst is behind you. You survived the winter without a fireplace, without walls worth the name, and without much more than the heat of bodies, the dim light of tallow candles, and the endless, tireless determination to see another spring. You pull your cloak tighter, a habit you won't break until midsummer, and smile, a thin, private smile. Let the wind howl. Let the last snows melt. You are still here. The fire has faded to embers now, the rushlight nothing more than a faint memory of flame. You breathe deep, the smoky air tinged with the sense of straw, wool, and a life lived close to the earth. Outside, the cold still lingers, but it no longer presses in with the same merciless grip. The night is quieter, softer, no longer a predator stalking the edges of your fragile warmth. Spring hums somewhere beyond the door, a promise not yet fully realized but near enough to taste. You shift slightly under your covers, stiff, scratchy, but oddly comforting now. Each layer, each heavy fold of cloth, feels like a shield woven from resilience. Your breath is slower now, steadier, as if your body finally understands it can rest. Tomorrow will bring work. Fields to turn, thatch to mend, life to rebuild from the wreckage winter leaves behind. But not tonight. Tonight, you listen to the faint stirrings of life around you, a sleepy murmur from the bundled bodies nearby, the faint snuffle of a pig rooting in its straw bed, the whisper of the wind losing its edge as it slinks past the walls it failed to breach. You made it through. The cold has less power now, a fading shadow against the first pale light of spring. Your eyelids grow heavy, the worries of frost and famine slipping away with each slow breath. The earth turns, the seasons shift, and soon, the world will be green again. For now, let the last threads of this night wrap around you. Let the quiet settle deep into your bones. Sleep, traveler. You've earned it. Sweet dreams.